Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, state lawmakers consider major policy changes as the end of the legislative session looms. Utahns and political parties react to our senators casting opposing votes on the divisive acquittal of former President Trump. And Utah looks to the future as it recovers from the economic crisis. Good evening and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Derek Miller, president and CEO of the Salt Lake Chamber and Downtown Alliance, Taylor Stevens, state government reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune, and Dennis Romboy, political reporter for the Deseret News. So glad to be with you all to talk politics tonight, the national level, but very local implications. I want to start with you, Dennis, on the impeachment trial. The second time we've had this, former President Trump acquitted for the second time. 7 Republicans voted for this conviction. One of ours, but was one of them, and our own Senator Mitt Romney. But I want to talk about what the implications are, not just for him, but for Mike Lee and where Utah is on this issue. Not about just what happened, but about going forward. First, you're reporting just yesterday on our most recent poll with whether or not the Senate should have convicted former President Trump. 51% of Utahns said no, 43% said yes.
You might think that could have been a little bit higher given his the vote he got here from the past election. I think it was around 58% of votes, something like that. But people are kind of divided about that. Obviously, though, Republicans, a much higher percentage said that he should have been acquitted. There are some political implications for Senator Romney and for Senator Lee as a result of this. We've seen a petition started to censure Senator Romney. I've also seen a Change.org petition thanking him for his vote. Just today, the Republican Accountability Project launched an ad campaign to bolster those senators who crossed party lines and voted for the conviction of President Trump.
Well, let's break that down. It's so interesting, Taylor, because there's no clear consensus on this. Utahns are divided when you talk about them generally. As Dennis alluded to, they're not so divided when it comes to their party. When it comes to that conviction, it was 74% of Republicans said that he should not have been convicted, and 92% of the Democrats.
Yeah, I think that this was a situation where people had their minds made up before they even took a vote, before they even came in and kind of went through that process. A lot of people already knew what they wanted to happen, and I think we continue to see that play out in the polling. Mm-hmm.
So, Derek, talk about how the candidates are looking at this. You've advised governors, been part of campaigns. What is happening inside the Republican Party that you're hearing as they try to make room for 2 elected officials within their own party that cast 2 very separate votes?
You know, it wouldn't surprise you because I think you're probably hearing the same thing, that you got some potential candidates out there, others who are being encouraged, maybe even recruited to run against both of our sitting senators. Of course, on one hand, you've got people who are saying, I'm upset with Mike Lee because of his vote. I may challenge him. I may try to find someone to challenge him. Same thing with Senator Romney. Of course, Senator Lee up in 2 years, Senator Romney up in 4. I'm actually of the opinion that former President Trump is such a divisive character. The issue is so divisive. I don't see that as a winning platform, at least not today, because as many people who would say you've got to challenge him, you've got to challenge one of the senators because of their vote in this direction. You got as many people on the other side of the issue saying we got to support that same senator for the opposite reason.
Yeah, it's just such a... Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, and with Senator Lee's strength within the party, I don't see too much trouble for him in the convention. And there may be someone that can get on the ballot and challenge him through the signature process next year, but I don't see too much trouble ahead for him that way.
Well, let's break down those numbers a little bit, too, to your great points about that. If you look at the raw approvals in this poll that Hinckley just did with the Deseret News, Taylor, Mike Lee, 45% approval, 41% disapproval. I want to do that as it relates to Mitt Romney, 50% approval, 45% disapproval. It's just so interesting how mostly these numbers have not changed for either one of them, even in spite of their vote.
Yeah, again, I just think that speaks to, people have their minds made up about how they see these characters. And I don't think that they really shifted their views from the last impeachment. And so I don't think that they did anything unexpected here for Utahns. So the ones who agreed with them the last time, nothing has really changed for them in this round of impeachment.
Well, let's talk about how the Republican Party in Utah is going to handle this, because I want to read a statement, because the person who's had to answer this question this week is Derek Brown. He's the chairman of the Utah Republican Party. So people are asking him the question, well, how are you going to handle this? You've got a lot of support from the Republicans for Mike Lee, not so much from the Republicans for Mitt Romney, but how is the tent big enough for both of these two particular candidates here, too? And I want to read this statement from Derek Brown, and maybe Derek Miller, if you'll take a second to answer what Derek Brown is trying to do here. He says, as a party, I think this is a great opportunity for us to think about the fact that we have two senators who experienced effectively the same set of facts and came to differing conclusion. And that's okay, that's normal, that's healthy. And I think that is a hallmark of a healthy political party. That's a big statement for some very different views.
It's a good statement. I'm glad that Derek made that statement. I think he's doing an exceptional job in a very difficult situation under the best of circumstances, but under these circumstances, which a Republican president is getting impeached not once but twice, and you've got your two senators on opposite sides of the issues. But the sum and substance of what Chairman Brown has said, I think, is so important, and that is there's so much talk about unity, which I think is great, but how about more talk about valuing a diversity of opinion and valuing a diversity of thought? I think we need more of that in our country. I'm glad that he made that statement.
I think another thing that's at play here is, the Republican Party did see many people leave nationally and also in Utah. And I think that, there's a recognition that there's some work to do at home to kind of, bring this big tent in and unify people locally as well. And so, Derek Brown has said there's work to do at home as well. And we need to focus on that rather than these divisive issues.
And Derek Brown's job is to get Republicans elected, right? So Mitt Romney may not fare well in a state convention, but in a primary election or in a general election, he's likely to attract those moderate voters that have kind of tried to stay with the party as far as Mitt Romney's concerned. So.
Yeah. So Dennis, to that great point, I mean, we almost have to identify the fact that there's some national polling going on right now that's including Mitt Romney on the list of potential candidates for run for president.
I don't think that's ever ended since his last run in 2012. I think his name has continued to be, bandied about as a potential candidate. He's repeatedly said, twice is enough, and I'm not doing this a third time. He'll be, 70? He's 73 right now. The next presidential election, he would be 77. And, Joe Biden's around that age himself. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, I guess, but I just don't see that happen.
Mm-hmm. Most recent poll, he picked about
Jason?
4%. Yes, Derek.
I was just going to say, I think the interesting question is not, is Mitt Romney going to run for president again? The interesting question to me is, will he run to be a U.S. Senator from Utah again?
I think that's a great question. And he hasn't really revealed that as well, and I think I've seen a couple of fundraising emails come through from him, so I don't know if that's a signal or not. Mike Lee, on the other hand, is a full court press on fundraising right now.
Yeah. So Taylor, to this really great and insightful point here too, some people have made the comment that he's taking the kind of votes of a person that's not planning to run again. These are the kind of controversial votes that you make when I'm not really worried about political ramifications.
Yeah, we've seen Romney also talk about his faith and how he has been an outsider in many times in his life, and how that has given him, the strength to make moves that not everyone agree with, that he doesn't have to follow the pack. And so I think it could also speak to his personal values and faith, and may not necessarily signal that he doesn't plan to run again.
I think he had an epiphany of sorts too, because in the past he made some decisions out of political expediency, and he said, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to vote my conscience. I'm going to go with my faith. I'm going to go with my gut and my heart on these votes.
Mm-hmm. We'll watch these races very closely, because there's a lot. And as Derek mentioned, he still has 4 years to try to make his case here, even the state of Utah, with what he wants to do. We need to get into the legislative session. A lot has happened, even since the last week on our program. A lot of bills moving forward, and some are just popping up. This is the time when you start seeing some of these interesting bills. But one is a theme that we heard through the summer as our legislature dealt with the pandemic. And Taylor, I'd like to hear what you're hearing about efforts to corral the governor's power, specifically when it comes to the emergency declaration powers. This is a struggle that we've seen play out. Legislature's taken a move.
Yeah, as you mentioned, we've been hearing conversation about this throughout the interim, throughout the summer, and we finally saw a bill that was released on Tuesday by leadership in the House. And the bill does seem to have some bipartisan support. Senator Luz Escamilla, a Democrat from Salt Lake City, has come out in support of it. And it just kind of speaks to this push and pull between who should have power during a long-term emergency, because lawmakers say that the Emergency Powers Act we have now never contemplated a pandemic. It was more a wildfire, an earthquake, something short-term, 30 days.
Mm-hmm. Derek, give us some context on this, because you actually helped with the whole response effort on behalf of the state. You continue to help advise. What's at the heart of this power struggle? What are the legislators trying to reclaim?
Well, I think, as Taylor pointed out, at the heart of the matter is the eternal struggle between two branches of government. And we see it playing out on this particular battlefield, which is a unique battlefield. We'd never dealt with a pandemic, not in our lifetimes at least. I saw early on the governor's office obviously wanting to take charge, operating those levers of government, needing to take charge. But the legislature didn't want to be left out and felt left out in the early days of the pandemic. It became highly controversial in very important ways, because Governor Herbert was issuing emergency declarations that were shutting some businesses. People were losing jobs. It's hard to even remember, let alone articulate, just how many uncertainties and unknowns there were way back in March and April of last year. But the legislature wants to be involved. I think Governor Herbert did the right thing in getting them involved quickly. But I think now the legislature says, hey, we don't want a repeat of what was happening in March, and we don't want to have to rely on the good graces of the governor to have a seat at the table. We're going to create a seat at the table. Frankly, they probably need to have one, in my opinion.
One thing that's interesting in this conversation, though, and that the governor mentioned yesterday, is that the legislature has all along had the power to call itself into a special session. The voters gave them that power recently, and so they didn't need the executive branch to give them that power to make these changes. And so he says, I wish that they would be more involved. I think that they should have been, but, they didn't want the political fallout of making these tough decisions. And now that we are sort of further on in the pandemic, now they're kind of trying to take back some of this power and act like they haven't had a role to play all along.
Well, it is a unique situation, but like Taylor mentioned, the legislature can call itself into special session, but that power only came to be, maybe 3 years ago, right? So we've seen this kind of effort over the last 3 or 4 years for the legislature to try to take some power, or maybe more clearly to balance the power out a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. So Dennis, to that point, go ahead, Derek.
Well, I was just going to say, Taylor mentioned the special session, and back in April and May, when the legislature did call itself into a special session, one of the specific things that it did was to create an economic response commission. And it was made up of legislators. It was made up of folks from the private sector. I was asked to sit on that commission. I thought that commission was very effective in making suggestions to the governor. At the end of the day, it was the governor's choice. But I can tell you, as someone who sat on that commission as well as chaired the governor's economic response task force, we would not be in as good a economic position as a state were it not for that legislative created commission that was really looking at data and frankly pressing the governor's office to make some tough decisions, but some important decisions.
Mm-hmm. To the same issue here, because it's not just really confined just to the governor's office, right, Dennis? There's also a bill to bring back some of the power from the Attorney General for the state of Utah, Sean Reyes, and his ability to enter into lawsuits and to sign on to lawsuits from other states.
I think that was a direct result of Sean Reyes involving the state in that Texas lawsuit trying to overturn election results in 4 states that Utah was not one of those states. And even the Governor Herbert and then Governor-elect Cox both condemned that action and said that Utah shouldn't be involved in elections in other states. And I think that's what prompted that bill. And our Attorney General is involved the state in a number of lawsuits, especially ones that the Democrats aren't fond of.
Right.
Obamacare and such things like that.
There's another slate of gun bills, Taylor. Every session we see some of those. Some sessions, some of them start to gain some traction. Sometimes they don't. But let's talk about a couple of those. One in particular, already signed by the governor, the constitutional carry bills. If you can conceal a weapon without going through the class or getting a permit or getting a background check now if you're 21 plus years old. Is there anything different about this year than years past when Governor Herbert, for example, vetoed a similar bill?
I think one thing we have seen that's different than, say, last year, for example, is there was a lot more momentum behind gun control bills in the last session on the heels of Parkland and March for Our Lives. And I think we're seeing a little bit less momentum for those types of efforts, which has been overshadowed by the pandemic and other issues. One thing that we are seeing with gun bills this year that I think is heavily influenced by the pandemic and some of the mental health challenges is we are seeing a slate of bills coming forward that deal with more safety training, more, kind of going from that mental health angle of making sure that people who are struggling, that they have avenues to make sure that they're not putting themselves in a position of danger with their firearms.
Mm-hmm. Now, Derek, we're also, not only that one, we also have a bill allowing maybe for a gun safety class in high schools. We're seeing that, but also a bill by Representative Ellison that allows someone to voluntarily surrender a weapon if they're having a mental health crisis of some sort.
So the thing that surprised me the most about the concealed weapon permit going away and having the so-called constitutional carry is how little controversy it seems to have generated. And, maybe that's just a virtue of the pandemic, and it's difficult for people to weigh in or be up at the Capitol in any sort of large group or mass demonstration. I remember serving in the governor's office the last time this came up, and as you mentioned, Jason, Governor Herbert vetoed that, and they were not able, the legislature was not able to muster enough votes for a veto override, but it was highly controversial. I hear almost nothing about it today. On the note of taking the gun safety class, I'm a concealed carry permit holder. I guess I don't need the permit anymore, or soon won't need it anymore. But I only bring it up because the real value for me in getting that permit was going through the mandatory safety course. I found it, even though I'd been around guns my whole life and had used them, it was highly valuable for me. So I hope that the legislature will do more to make those courses not just available, but to make them part of getting a gun.
A component of that training was a suicide prevention module, brief video talking about suicide prevention, and not as many people will be exposed to that piece of it if they don't take the training now, if it's not required. And I think some people in mental health fields and deal with suicide are a little bit concerned about that. Although I guess Representative Ellison was successful in getting some of that money from the permit program diverted to mental health prevention or intervention and help.
That's right. It is so interesting. And it is interesting how this one went through the legislature so quickly, right? Even signed before the end, when this used to be one of those issues that would occupy a lot of the legislative session. One that is, Taylor, let's talk about one bill that has been occupying a lot of time and a lot of commentary in the press too. It was about transgender athletes, particularly transgender female athletes in sports. We've talked about it on this program for the last couple of weeks, but it took a little bit of a turn this week in terms of the people supporting and opposing it. Talk about what's happening right there, noting, of course, that collegiate sports was taken out of the bill, so it applies only to high school athletes.
Yeah, one thing that we saw happen this week, so first of all, the bill passed through the House, and so that signals some support, at least from, a majority of lawmakers there. We'll see how, it goes through the Senate, of course, but the next day, the governor did say that he will not sign the bill in its current form. He's not supportive of it, and he feels like it is, sort of going to provide some challenges for a community that already is very vulnerable, and that he wants to see it be more inclusive and see Utah be more inclusive to the LGBTQ community.
Mm-hmm. So this was a big statement, Derek, from the governor. People were wondering what he was going to say. The chamber has weighed in on this as well. The Salt Lake Chamber has as well. So the Senate still has to take this up. It passed by the House with what you would say is a veto-proof majority in the House. The Senate has to take it up now with comments from not just our governor, but also the Salt Lake Chamber.
Well, I am so far from being anywhere close to being an expert on this issue. It is such a delicate issue. It is such a nuanced issue. It is such an emotionally charged issue. I think Governor Cox was correct when he said we need to tread lightly here, and this is not something we ought to rush into. We shouldn't be making rush decisions one way or the other. I think his comment yesterday was we need to hit the pause button on this. That's why the chamber's position is that it ought to be decided by local school districts. We understand that local school districts are already looking at it closely. It ought to be done in consultation with medical experts. And I think based on a poll that I saw this morning from the Hinckley Institute, while not a majority of the people, but the highest percentage of the people felt the same way, that it ought to be decided by school districts in consultation with medical professionals.
Yeah, Dennis, let's break this out, because you wrote the story, because that is the most important point here. In this poll, which asked if a transgender woman should be allowed to compete, it was 61% of Utahns said no, 16% did no, which goes to the complexity of this. But what Derek just said is the most important part, is who should make the decision about it.
Yeah, and the poll showed that it should be the High School Activity Association, or in the case of collegiate sports, the NCAA. And I think only 5% of people said government should make this decision. And here we are as a government trying to make this decision. I thought that was very interesting.
Yes, I agree.
I think it's important to note that the Utah High School Activities Association does have a policy on this, and they have not come under any problems with that policy. Also, the fact that there are no women in Utah schools, young girls who are transgender, who are participating in sports. And so, while the sponsor says that she sees there's a need to, protect women's sports, there are other people who say this is a kind of a bill in search of a problem that doesn't currently exist.
There was a bill in Idaho passed last year that a federal judge immediately put a hold on after a lawsuit was filed. I would suspect if this were to pass here, the same thing would happen. However, there could be some economic backlash, and maybe Derek could speak to that better.
Yeah, because maybe start on the economic part of that, Derek, because I have some other economic questions for you also.
Well, of course, it'd be conjecture to say what would or what wouldn't happen, but we've certainly heard from some of our members of the Salt Lake Chamber that they're concerned about their ability to bring future events to the state of Utah. We saw what happened in North Carolina. I'm not necessarily trying to say that what happened in North Carolina with the so-called bathroom ban is exactly the same thing. I guess some would argue that it is, but the point, I think important point is that there are often economic consequences if a state gets a reputation as not being sensitive to this issue. And I think that's the one thing that we all ought to want to be, regardless of the opinion, whether we're in the 60% or the 17% or the remainder. We all should want to be sensitive to the issue.
Mm-hmm. This does lead to a couple of distinctions the state had, because the sign that you put on the state does matter. And I want to talk about a couple distinctions Utah did get this last week that you helped work on, not just with your hat with the Governor's Office of Economic Development, but also with the Chamber. A couple of our cities hitting the number one. In fact, the Provo City jumped into the number one best performing city in the country. That is a pretty big distinction.
Well, I'm feeling pretty good today because I'm a native of Provo. I grew up in Provo, so that's my hometown, and I'm also a resident of Salt Lake City and president of the Salt Lake Chamber. So the Salt Lake Provo connection is pretty strong today. To have two cities in one state that are in the top 5 is pretty remarkable. And what I really want to highlight is just the fact that I think our prospects are also brighter than ever. One of the things that the pandemic has unveiled is this disconnect between where you live and where your job is located. I think Utah is going to benefit very well from that. In fact, already is. When I talk to my realtor friends in Park City and St. George, they tell me we got people moving here from all over the country. because they've just figured out they can live somewhere different from where their job is located, and Utah is where they're choosing it, and bringing all that talent to the state will bode very well for our economic future.
It's a great distinction, but I want to highlight one other point that's underlying some of this around the country, but in the state of Utah. Taylor, a little bit on the impacts of COVID-19 on jobs, but specifically jobs for women. An interesting and very concerning report just came out. In December, the country lost 140,000 jobs, all of them women. This is a big issue, what people are calling the she-cession, what is happening right now, getting women back in the workforce.
Yeah, we are seeing that women have had to make the decision to leave their jobs. Many times we know women are the primary caregivers, that they take on a lot more of those challenges. And so with childcare closed or more expensive, with belts tightening, with COVID, we have seen this have a big impact on women. And that's something that we're also exploring on the impact on Utah women. At the Salt Lake Tribune, we have a reporter who is dedicated to covering women, and the impacts of COVID is one of the issues that she's looking into right now. And so there's still, I think, a lot of work to be done to really get a good handle on that. But we do know that this pandemic has hit women hard, and we'll see, once things start going back to normal, if women are able to make up the gains that they have made in so many years.
In our last 30 or 40 seconds, the Tribune did a survey of our legislators, and at least one piece of legislation emerged this session that may help with this. What is it?
Yeah, there are a few bills around childcare that would help with that. Just a lot of ways that we're looking at the impacts on women, and, we'll see where those end up going.
Yeah, so we'll watch those closely. This is an issue the whole state of Utah takes note of, particularly when it comes to the list we're starting to rise on. Thank you for this, and thank you for your very thoughtful comments this evening. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us, and see you next week.